61207. Strangely.
Yeah, don't worry about it. I can see. No, it's fine.
Something amiss with my loudspeakers. So let's go on without it. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. At least this week there were more pictures that I could find, even though many of them were the creation of our Victorian ancestors and their imagination. I hope you've seen the email this morning saying that Pat Gumley had died. I always get a nasty shock when I'm advised of a death. Given that we're all in God's waiting room in one form or another, I don't suppose we should be too surprised, but it still makes for sad reading, especially when someone like Pat's has been a regular member and who we've not been mixing with over the last 3 years, but there you go. Right, I'm now going to change seats with Judy and leave you in her capable hands whilst I go and get the glass of water, which I've forgotten. She has taken umbrage about the film star glasses and is not wearing them now. You go and stand by me.
Yeah.
I shall put that under your feature.
Right. Oops. Yeah. There.
Right, you're good.
Right. Yeah, right. Good morning, everybody. Oh, what does it say down? I'll get a bit closer. Oh, well, yes, I will. Good morning, everybody. I'm not wearing the sunglasses because I can't see my notes if I wear the sunglasses. So it's me without any eye makeup on. I hope it's not too shocking and awful. Look away if you find it too shocking and awful. I can wear eye makeup on Thursday. So I can't wait for Thursday because I don't feel like me at all. But it is me. And I hope you're all staying well. And if you've been on holiday or away, I hope it's been a success. The Crusades. Thank you, Martin. The Crusades. Oh. I've included them because they are very important. They went on for a long time. We only really pay attention to the first 3 Crusades. But in fact, they went on and on throughout the Middle Ages. And it's just important to say that they were still current in people's minds in the reign of Henry VIII. Henry VIII actually wrote to the Pope before he decided to end his marriage with to Catherine of Aragon, when he was still hoping against hope that she would bear him a son, although it was seeming less and less likely. And he wrote to the Pope and said, if God grants me a son, if you will pray as well, which the Pope was doing, if I'm granted a son, I will go on crusade against the Turk. And of course, he didn't have a son by Catherine of Aragon, so he didn't need to keep his promise. But he was totally sincere, and Jerusalem obviously was still in possession of the Turk. It belonged to the Turks, and ever since has been Muslim until 1948 when it was divided. So the origin of crusading is interesting. How did this great movement, this great European movement, how did it start? Well, a simple reason, that a new type of Muslim, the fierce Seljuk Turks, a tribe, they were a tribe, had defeated the Abbasid dynasty. Now, the Abbasid Muslims had been pretty reasonable about other faiths. They had accepted Jews as being very similar to them in regard to worship, and had accepted Christians. And they had allowed Christians to go to what became known as the holy places in the Holy Land, Bethlehem, and particularly Jerusalem, on pilgrimage to worship and to either ask for favors or redeem a promise made, a vow made. If such and such happens, I will go to Jerusalem and pay my respects at the very place where Jesus died for our sins. It was a very, very difficult journey for pilgrims to go across Europe, across what's now called Eastern Europe, which at the time was in chaos, constant fighting. There were brigands on practically every road. Even crossing a bridge cost money, because many bridges were either toll bridges, or there were brigands waiting to take your money before they would let you cross the bridge. So it cost a fortune. It cost an arm and a leg for pilgrims, even in organized groups, to get from Western Europe to Jerusalem. It cost a great deal in money, it cost a great deal in time, and it cost a lot of, you paid in terms of courage. It was dangerous, but it was allowed. And then the Seljuk Turks took over, and they began to harass pilgrims. They wanted them to convert them, basically. They wanted them to become Muslim. And they didn't approve of Christianity, made that very clear, that the Christians were their enemies. And so they made, it was a sort of new regime, a bit like the Taliban taking over in Afghanistan. They were cheating, harassing, imprisoning, holding Christians to ransom, injuring them if they didn't pay the ransom. It had all turned very unpleasant for Christian pilgrims. And of course, if you went to Jerusalem, you would gain remission of many of your sins. In fact, many people said they wanted to die in Jerusalem. Many Christian pilgrims actually longed to die, which wasn't all that unusual, actually, because not only was the journey difficult, when you got there, there were all sorts of, because it was so hot, there were all sorts of health hazards, heat stroke, and being getting some sort of oriental disease. So a lot of people actually said they would like to die in Jerusalem, because then they would go straight to heaven. They wouldn't be judged, their sins wouldn't be counted against them. They would have instant remission and they'd be able to go to heaven. So this was the situation that this fierce tribe, rather like the Taliban, had taken over the Holy Land, taken over Jerusalem, and they were making excuse me, very difficult for Christian pilgrims to fulfill their vow of pilgrimage to the holy city. And the Emperor of Byzantium, now Constantinople, now Istanbul, it was Constantinople, it was Byzantium, then it was Constantinople, called after the Emperor Constantine, and then now Istanbul. So the Emperor of Byzantium asked for help from Pope Urban II, because the Seljuk Turks were very fine warriors. The Abbasids had been more scholarly, and they weren't particularly great warriors, but the Seljuk Turks are sort of specialized in being warriors, and they were very successful. Their armies were sweeping across areas that had formerly been at peace. And so the Emperor of Byzantium started to panic and decided that he needed some allies. And he asked for help. And so he asked for help from Pope Urban II. And the Patriarch of Byzantium added his pleas, could you help us? We're afraid the Turks are going to take over, which eventually they did. 1453, the Eastern Orthodox Church, well, not the church, but the Eastern Orthodox branch of what had been the Roman Empire was taken over by the Muslims. A terrible catastrophe, 1453. You kind of thought of it as the end of civilization as we knew it in Europe, when the Seljuk Turks actually took the great city of Byzantium and then swept across Europe. And actually, by the 17th century, they reached the gates of Vienna. It's something we're not really aware of, because we're an island. We weren't afraid. We weren't thinking, oh, they're going to come here. But it never got to that point. But they had swept across Eastern Europe and were winning every battle they fought. It was really terrifying to live in that part of Europe. So this request coincided with the Pope of the time, Urban II, wanting to increase the power and authority of the papacy. So it happened, some people say providentially, that he was anxious and eager to make more of his position. And he'd already been thinking, he needed some kind of a dramatic gesture, or some sort of something he could do to put the papacy even more on the map than it already was. So this was providential. He was now being given the opportunity. Intervention in this situation in far away on the other side of Europe, on the border of Asia. The aim was to liberate Palestine from Islamic rule. Not just Jerusalem, but the whole area. And the other aim was to unite the two branches of Christianity. Christianity has divided in the 11th century, still is divided into Eastern and Western forms of Christianity. So Catholic in the West, based in Rome, and Eastern, or what we call Eastern or Greek or Russian Orthodox in the East, based in originally Constantinople, Byzantium, now Istanbul. Two forms of Christianity. And the idea was that if they could unite in a military way, they could maybe, before it was too late, reunite and become one faith. It would just be Christianity. It wouldn't be the Western form and the Eastern form. It wouldn't be sort of Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. So there was a lot going on at the time. You can still say politically. Martin's found some lovely maps. So there was a sort of dynamism developing, leading to the First Crusade. Now, there's a very famous council held in November 1095, the Council of Clermont, which very impressively was a sort of huge gathering of clergy, top clergy, 13 archbishops, 82 bishops, and 90 abbots. I mean, in those days, that was pretty amazing to sort of contact them all and get them all to turn up at a certain place on a certain day. You know, pretty impressive. When you think that all messages in those days were delivered by probably somebody on a horse, and then having to hang around while somebody hand wrote a letter or a note, and then take it back on said horse and deliver it. I mean, everything's so slow compared with today, and yet they achieved it. I mean, 90 abbots. I mean, pretty impressive. And Pope Urban preached this very, very famous sermon. Absolutely electrifying. He was a great speaker. He was a demagogue. Well, no, demagogue makes it sound a bit cheap and nasty. He was a great speaker, a great orator. That's the proper word. He was an orator. And he implored his audience to support their Byzantine Christian allies, forget about the split in the church, put that to one side. There'd been a call for help. We owed it to our fellow Christians. forget about the difference in doctrine and the split, go to their aid and assistance. But the other thing that he said was, we in this country in Europe need to fight to regain the holy city of Jerusalem. It's an outrage that it belongs to the Muslims who don't believe in Jesus as they think of him as a prophet. They don't deny that he was a prophet and a great prophet, but they believe that Muhammad was the final prophet. They don't think Muhammad's holy. They don't think he's the son of God, but he is the last prophet. Jesus was just one of many. So Pope Urban is saying it is an outrage that infidels, which is Latin for non-believers, that people who don't believe in Jesus as the Christ, hold his birthplace in Jerusalem, in Bethlehem, and they hold Jerusalem where he died for our sins. It's an outrage that this has happened, and we need to fight in a united way to regain Jerusalem and then all the Holy Land, wherever Christ walked and taught and then died. We need to liberate this land. A very powerful message. And there were various people there, you'd say investigative journalists, or just journalists. And of course, they didn't know any shorthand in those days, so they tried their very best to write down what he was saying as he was speaking. And unlike today, he didn't sort of hand out copies of his script. So they were desperately trying to write it down as he was saying it. So there are different versions, but they don't vary that much. And he said, let those who have been fighting against their brothers and relatives, which is a good point to make, he meant the Eastern Orthodox Christians, let those who have been fighting against their brothers and relatives now fight in an honourable way against the barbarians. That was quite a clever use of words. I mean, the Muslims weren't barbarians, but that was a kind of clever thing to say. Back to the Roman Empire. Yeah, the Romans desperately tried to keep the barbarians at bay. Let those who have been serving as mercenaries for small pay now obtain the eternal reward. Remission of sins. Let those who have been wearing themselves out in both body and soul now work for a double honour. And the Pope then went on to say, all who die by the way, whether by land or by sea or in battle against the pagans, interesting word again, pagans, the Muslims are not pagans. They have a powerful belief system and they believe in the same God that we believe in. So this is very clever of he's using these emotive words, barbarians, pagans, or in battle against the pagans shall have immediate remission of sins. Wow, that was something, immediate remission of sins. This I grant them through the power of God with which I am invested. So the technical name for this was a plenary indulgence, the remission of all penance for sin. And he closed his sermon by shouting, well, there's an argument how you say this, Deus vult or Dieu le veut, God wills it. He shouted this. And the people attending were so worked up into almost a frenzy by what he'd been saying to them. They shouted it back. God wills it. God wants this to happen. We are doing God's work. And all commentators said that the people listening were in a kind of state of rapture.
Judy, can I just ask something that occurs to me, having seen this when I read it up? They had no microphones.
No.
And he was a trained priest before he became Pope. So he would obviously have been used to using his voice. But I wonder how many people actually were able to hear him.
It's a very good question, actually, but I think people they did have methods of sort of having a meeting in a place with very, very good acoustics.
Yeah.
And nobody said, there's no record of anyone getting, you know, a crowd getting
Speak up.
getting agitated and saying, we can't hear anything you're saying. But yes, it is a good point. How did he speak? It wasn't such an enormous crowd. I mean, even until recently, you know, people like Keir Hardie used to stand and talk to enormous crowds. There's sort of evidence of that. There's a sort of film of Keir Hardie speaking to groups of miners and enormous groups of dockers, and they're standing there absolutely mesmerised by what he's saying. So I think they could hear. I think he had the ability to sort of make it possible, because otherwise, if people can't hear, they start talking, and then that makes the whole situation becomes a vicious circle, or vicious cycle. If you can't hear and you're talking, then it's making the situation worse. There isn't any evidence that people were restless or leaving the meeting and saying, oh, I can't hear what he's saying.
Sorry, what?
So,
No,
it's a very interesting point. You do wonder without microphones. So they decided there and then a sort of spontaneous agreement and a spontaneous outburst of rapture and determination. They were going to go and fight to regain the Holy Land, but particularly Jerusalem. They were going to retake the Holy City, as it's been described, holy to three faiths. So this council was a kind of turning point. It was the birth of the Crusader movement, which went on for hundreds of years. And the Crusaders, again, spontaneously made a new heraldic emblem to show their allegiance to Christ, that they weren't fighting. Normally, they wore a surcoat on top of their armour, and their horse wore a surcoat on top of their saddle, with the coat of arms of whoever they were fighting for, their overlord, in other words, or a king. If they were fighting directly on behalf of a king, then they would have his coat of arms. They had to show who their lord was. So this was again a spontaneous idea that they were going to use a cross, because they were going to fight for Jesus, to regain the land where he'd been born and lived and preached and died. And it would be a red cross on a white ground, white for purity, and the red cross. Red always connected with warfare, ever since the great god Mars had always been shown wearing a red cloak, and red, the colour of blood, the colour of sacrifice, the colour of courage. So very dramatic, because it showed up so well, because most coats of arms have got lots of detail and fussiness, although not so much at this period, in this period. But a red cross on a white ground, very dramatic and very striking, and visible at a great distance. And an amazing thing happened, that the armies gathered remarkably quickly. Again, you know, without all the modern technology that we enjoy, you know, pick a phone up, and these armies, it was like a miracle that the armies assembled so rapidly. People absolutely full of religious fervour and religious determination. This was a great challenge to these warriors, that they weren't going to be fighting each other. They were going to be fighting for a wonderful, noble cause. And even if they died on the journey, the Pope had promised them remission. The intention was there, even if they didn't actually make it to the Holy Land, and even if they didn't die in battle, it was unconditional. The Pope had said so. If they travelled, even if they died en route, they would still have remission of sins. And they were proud, of course, proud to be fighting for Christ, you know, the most important leader they could possibly imagine. It was very, very exciting, and that's why it became so many people, you could say, enlisted. There were three current developments which helped the First Crusade. One was the millennium, which, all right, it had happened in the year 1000. You'd say, well, that's pretty out of date. But it did cause great excitement at the time that in the book of Revelation, it does say that Satan will rule the earth for 1,000 years, called the last days, and then it will be the great day of judgment. Well, the 1,000 years was up in the year 1000, and people have been waiting for the second coming ever since then. So that sort of fitted in really with this crusade. Maybe that would trigger the great day of judgment. Once Jerusalem was captured, Christ would come back. So it fitted in with that belief, which was current, and certainly had been current in Europe, and was still very much an alive issue. And also this situation with the Byzantines, they wanted help against the Turks. They're very anxious to have allies. And the war against the infidel was described as a work pleasing to God. Even if you didn't get remission of your sins, it was pleasing to God. It was a bit like building up a CV, a religious CV, that when you died, you'd be able to say, well, I actually enlisted. They didn't come to the house and get me. I volunteered to go and fight for Christ. So, you know, please can you take that into account? I've been very sinful and done all sorts of awful things, but please can you take into account the fact that I volunteered to go and liberate Jerusalem, a work pleasing to God. And the other thing, which I didn't know until a few weeks ago, well, a few days ago, really, when I was researching this, Western Europe had made tremendous advances in the previous few years in terms of organizational ability, both secular and ecclesiastical. What we might say, becoming more efficient when it came to producing an army and feeding them, and the logistics of getting them from A to B, always a problem. How are you going to get a huge army from Western Europe right across Western Europe into Eastern Europe and right across to the Middle East? How are you going to do that? How are you going to feed them? How are you going to provide for them? How are you going to do that? Well, it was possible. It had become very much more a kind of available. So that's played into the hands. This was a great advantage, that it was possible to move great armies and to look after their welfare. And that was simply due to the fact that there had been so many wars and so many conflicts during that time, and people had learned how to supply long supply lines and to trade with the people as you went. You know, where were you going to get food for these armies? Were they going to take food with them? Were they going to buy it? Were they going to do the honourable thing and buy it from the local people? Or were they going to live off the land, which means you steal food by threatening people? You know, give us all your grain or give us all your flour, and otherwise we're going to kill you. Better to negotiate and pay, but otherwise you antagonize the people that you wanted to work with. So everything is sort of in favor of this crusade, and they've got very enthusiastic leaders that I've sort of listed alongside the official crusade, because it was official. There was a sort of spontaneous, a very tragic, spontaneous crusade led by somebody called Peter the Hermit, the powerful preacher and demagogue. And he, like the Pope, whipped up enthusiasm and preached so powerfully that thousands of people, including peasants, tragically, willing to leave their farms, leave their land, and go to liberate, not the Holy Land, but particularly Jerusalem. It was called the People's Crusade. And they didn't reach the Promised Land. They didn't reach the Holy Land. many were sold into slavery. And we're talking about white slavery, of course, which was current. People now think of slavery as people being kidnapped from Africa, but slavery was current even after all these countries had become Christian. It's rather a shocking thing to think about, but slaves were a commodity. And rather than keeping, look, there weren't prisoner of war camps in those days. If you caught people, then you traded them off. You could sell them. You could either ransom them so that they'd be able to go home. Their families would pay to get them back, which we've already mentioned. But the further you got into Eastern Europe, they tended to sell people on as slaves, sort of left over from the Roman Empire. The fact that they were Christian didn't seem to make any difference. They still sold them. And here were people who were not very organized. Peter the Hermit was a preacher, not a war leader. It wasn't a general. And many thousands of people that joined that crusade ended up being sold as slaves and disappeared from history. We don't know what happened to them. The other awful thing that happened was that the noble armies, led by top people who were related to royal families in various countries in Western Europe, also behaved they behaved badly, although they'd taken the cross. They were full of religious enthusiasm, religious fervor. As they traveled across Eastern Europe, particularly Hungary, they murdered thousands of Jews as part of God's holy work, as work pleasing to God. That's how they justified it. The Jews were infidels. Didn't seem to realize that they worshipped the same God that we worship. They didn't worship Christ, and therefore they were non-believers, they were infidels, they were no better than animals, and they should be killed and offered to God almost as a sacrifice. And this would please God. It just makes us realize how very different attitudes were in the past. So that absolutely shock us now, because things have moved on so much. But it's hard for us to accept that these were our ancestors and the way they thought. They thought it was all right to kill Jews, and that it was the pleasing God that is shocking. That God would be really pleased at what they were doing. They were ridding the world of Jews, the people who killed the Christ. That's what they said. That's totally justified. They killed the Christ, therefore they are not fit to live. So that was a huge blot on, and it didn't mean that everybody agreed with it. It was a blot on the Crusades' reputation, and of course it was hushed up at the time, because there were many people who thought that was a despicable thing to have done, because most of the Jews were totally unarmed. I mean, they were civilians. They hadn't taken up arms at all. So it was murder. It was murder. But the way it was looked at then by many people was they were doing God a great favor, and will be rewarded. Will be rewarded. Hard for us to get our heads around that now. So that was a disaster. And the joint armies beat the Turks. They captured Nicaea. They went on to capture Antioch to great triumph. And Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders again. And this has been hushed up for a long time, but now modern historians look for the truth. They try to go through all these barriers that have been put up over the centuries and things that have been hushed up because they're so embarrassing. I've been to Jerusalem. We went, I went in I think it was 1987. It started off as a Methodist, it was a package tour, a Christian tour, Christian pilgrimage. Started off Methodist, couldn't get enough Methodists to go, so then we opened it out and it was ecumenical, which was lovely. We had a trainee priest from New Oscott, who later became Father Murphy. he was a student, so he came with us. And we had Anglicans and Catholics and URC and Baptists and Anglicans. It was brilliant. 18 people, all mixed. It was lovely. And we had a lovely guide. More about him shortly. He was Jewish. He normally took Jewish groups. He normally said he took Jewish American groups. And he was fascinated by taking a Christian group. I mean, he kept saying, I'm learning as much from you as you are from me. But he was a superb guy because he was interested in everything. He was very interested in animals and birds and trees and flowers. And he'd done archaeology. He was very interested in history. He was a really excellent, really knowledgeable guide. And he was particularly interested in the Crusades, and also obviously interested in anti-Semitism and the fact that so many Jews had been killed in the Rhineland, which isn't all that far away from us, even in those days. Jews killed in their thousands just for being Jewish. Now, when we got to Jerusalem, obviously he was talking about the First Crusade, and we were actually in the bazaar, which is very, very old. It dates back to Saxon, our equivalent to our Saxon times. And the guides, or in this case Abram, showed us this mark on the wall and said, that's how deep the blood ran. That's the legend of the blood. That's how deep it ran, because they slaughtered so many of the Muslims, civilians, in the bazaar, and they killed them and left their bodies lying just lying, and they bled out, of course. And it is historically accepted that the streets ran with blood like a river. So many people were killed. Didn't have a chance to defend themselves. They hadn't actually got weapons. So it wasn't a battle. It was the capture of Jerusalem, which was, we would say, a war crime and an absolute atrocity. But because it was Crusaders and because they'd got Jerusalem, it was signalled all over Europe as an absolute triumph. God had willed it and it had happened. And it was a wonderful thing, and there was rejoicing and special services. And then the inside story is that all this awful massacre had taken place. They hadn't taken the Muslims prisoner, or they hadn't said, we've captured you now, you're free to carry on trading. They'd killed them, and the streets in the bazaar had run with blood. Now, whether this mark on the wall really was where the blood had reached, it is doubtful, but it's interesting that they're still showing that to tourists, that it was kind of hushed up, not at the time, but it was hushed up later because it was so embarrassing. That Christians had killed these Muslims in cold blood. I mean, it wasn't cold blood as far as they were concerned. They were absolutely in a state of religious fervor. They hardly knew what they were doing. They were killing Muslims because they thought it pleased God. But a massive blot on the escutcheon of the Crusaders, has to be said. Now we are being honest, and now we are trying to get at the absolute truth without the propaganda and without the sort of religious context. But if the Crusaders did it, then it must be all right because they were holy men. They were seen as specially blessed by God, and they were holy. And therefore, how could they do anything sinful? That was the sort of argument at the time, and for centuries afterwards. And it's only sort of recently that people are sort of removing the veil and saying, well, this is what really happened. And we have reason to feel very ashamed, or should have reason to feel very ashamed. So hundreds of civilians killed, the streets running red with blood, but Jerusalem had been liberated. So European rejoicing, well, Christian rejoicing. And then as a result, 4 Crusader states were set up. The county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And Christian lords were put in charge of each of those and were regarded as kings or princes. And they had liberated what they said was the Holy Land. So they'd taken Israel, the Palestinian lands, now the Palestinian land, the West Bank of the Gaza Strip. They had been incredibly successful. As long as you don't count in the massacre of the Jews and the massacre of the Muslims, they had been successful militarily. God had smiled on them and had favored them. And not only would they been successful militarily, they presumably, they believed, gained remission of their sins. So win-win. And these kingdoms flourished for a time. They became rich through trade because they were coastal. And Christian pilgrimage, the whole point of the Crusades really was to make Christian pilgrimages possible. And that, of course, happened straight away, that the holy places were open to Christian pilgrims. And so that was certainly, nobody could doubt that that was a success. But had the Seljuk Turks just sort of curled up and decided not to challenge? No, of course not. They were determined they were going to get their lost lands back. So that's why there were such a lot of crusades. It was the Turks getting Jerusalem back, and eventually what they did, and then it was the Christians trying to get the Jerusalem back again from the Turks, and it just went on and on throughout the Middle Ages. So the Crusader states were successful in the sense that they were able to trade and become prosperous. The Second Crusade was 1145 to 1149. And this was because the Turks had retaken Edessa, and the Christians there begged for help. Many had been killed or sold as slaves. So the Turks frequently sold people as slaves. It was one of the main things that they did to get money. So we're back to this situation where Christians are being prevented from reaching the Holy Land. They're being sold as slaves before they can get there. Now, there were two leaders. We weren't involved. Let's say our kings were not involved in the Second Crusade, although people sent money. The two leaders were the German King Conrad III, Holy Roman Emperor, and Louis VII, King of France, at the time married to Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was very much the boss, because he was a bit useless and hopeless. It's always regarded as a complete failure. It wasn't really completely a failure, but they had too many goals, too many objectives. Their planning was useless. They tended to say, God will sort it out when we get there. He will tell us what to do. Well, that didn't work. And they didn't seem to organize the logistics very sensibly, and they certainly didn't seem to work out how they were going to get food and water. Water in particular, a nightmare in a very hot country. The Turks have been very clever when it came to water supply. They filled it. They hadn't filled in the wells. They just disguised them, so the Westerners didn't know where the water supplies were anymore. So they were drinking stale water, or they were getting it from. Well, it was a big problem getting water in a hot country. A lot of the men were just permanently dehydrated and therefore weak. They weren't being very good soldiers. Also, if you don't get washed, you get diseases in a hot country. You know, you get and ordinary things like fleas and mites and ticks and horrible things that carry diseases are more likely to attack you if you're dirty and smelly. We'll come back to that as an issue. So with food problems, particularly water problems, lack of organization, the Turks were now resurgent. You know, they were really happy. Don't forget, they were praying to the same God that we were praying to. They were praying for victory. So they believed that God was restoring the Islamic faith. So the Second Crusade, failure. Third Crusade, which is where we are heavily involved because Richard I was a crusading king, which is why he got this fantastic reputation as being an absolutely all-round good guy. You know, right up there with chocolate. He's absolutely amazing. The big statue of him outside the House of Commons for some weird and wonderful reason. Victorians absolutely loved Richard I because he was a crusader, because he was such a good Christian. He was willing to risk his life in order to retake Jerusalem. It was all, you know, he was just an absolutely wonderful role model, and offered as a role model to boys in public schools, because it to the Victorians, certainly, Richard I fighting for Christ in the Holy Land was very much like young men in the army fighting for the empire, fighting in hot countries where there were sort of you know, lack of good food, lack of water. You know, you would have to suffer for your belief in the empire, just as the Crusaders suffered because they were trying to liberate the land for Christ. So the Victorians thought Richard I was absolutely wonderful, and he wasn't. It's a sort of false role model. So the Third Crusade was triggered by the fact that the Turks were resurgent. They were excellent. When we think about them, they were excellent warriors, highly organized. They never seemed to get short of food and water. They knew where the water was, and they say very clever at disguising the water so that other people couldn't avail themselves of these desert wells. So the Turks recaptured Antioch, Damascus, and were threatening to reconquer the Holy Land. And they also had a great leader, Saladin, Sultan of Egypt, fantastic general, and like Pope Urban, he was very good at invigorating his troops if they weren't, you know, if they felt they were there, sort of losing heart. He was a great orator and a great leader, and he won a decisive victory at a battle called Hattin, which is not far from Jerusalem. And Hattin, when we went, we were taken to Hattin, or at least we could see it. We didn't go right into it, but it's called the Horns of Hattin. They're sort of two sort of mountain peaks, and they look like horns on an animal. So it's called the Horns of Hattin. The actual battle is the Battle of Hattin. Now, our guide, as I say, was very, very good at history, and he'd specialised in the Crusades. And he actually said the crusading knights were still wearing chainmail. Plate armor hadn't been invented. Little pieces were sometimes incorporated into chainmail, but basically they were still wearing chainmail, which is kind of, it's like crocheting with metal rings, all interlocked with each other. And I don't know whether any of you have been to Warwick Castle and held the chainmail, because it's one of the things they do for the tourists. They got a chunk of original chainmail. I seem to remember it was about 2 feet square, and they offer to, you don't have to hold it, but they offer you it if you'd like to hold it, and it weighs a ton. They sort of give you it, and your hands immediately dip down because it's amazingly heavy. It's like being given several house bricks to hold all at once. Absolutely, really, really heavy, and that's just a small piece of chainmail. So wearing chainmail, goodness knows how they did anything. No wonder they had very powerful, big, strong shire horses to ride, because ordinary horses, they just collapse, their legs hadn't gone from under the incredibly heavy man on board wearing this fantastically heavy armor. The beauty of chainmail was that it was flexible. You could move in it, whereas plate armor, not so much. And also, if you knocked somebody off their horse wearing plate armor, sometimes they died of their helmet knocking against their head and they got brain damage. So a man knocked off his horse wearing plate armor was a pretty helpless creature. It was a bit like a lobster stuck inside its shell. So the beauty, so chainmail had its advantages, but our guide told us that because of the lack of water And because we didn't know, so the Western Crusaders didn't know how to find water, they didn't waste water getting washed. They didn't take their chainmail off. They just lived in it. And they got, and of course they were sweating all the time, so they were dehydrating. But anyway, he was very interested in telling us this horrible story about they didn't get washed for weeks and weeks and weeks. They were sweating all the time. This attracted all sorts of insect activity, which is another story. That they got dysentery and they got typhus, they got all sorts of things because they were unclean. But he said and he wasn't exaggerating, he said there was plenty of chronicler evidence for this, that you could smell the crusading army a mile away if the wind was in the right direction. They absolutely stank, he said. They absolutely stank. As a result, the Turkish army kept finding out where they were. So it was very difficult for them to keep their plans secret because they smelled. They could be the Turkish army knew where they were. Plus the discomfort of wearing this chainmail, the weight of it in the sun. Many of them had used their surcoat for other reasons. They didn't go into detail, but maybe as bandages or whatever, because supply lines were so difficult. So many of them were in the blazing sun, in an incredibly heavy, we say, suit of armor, like a tunic, very heavy, very horrible inside, because they hadn't got washed and taken the chainmail off, and they're all smelly and horrible. They were suffering from acute discomfort before the battle even started. Probably itching and just thinking about, thirsty, hungry. So everything favoured the Turks, and the battle was an absolute disaster for the crusading knights. Absolute disaster. So this triggered the Third Crusade, and the Pope this time was Gregory VIII, who also made impassioned speeches, but it was never quite the same as the Pope Urban, who initiated the First Crusade. So the leaders were, again, royal, Philip II, King of France, Richard I, King of England, and Frederick Barbarossa, Frederick Redbeard, Holy Roman Emperor, or they often put, they put Germany, although Germany, as you know, was not a united country until 1871. Germany wasn't a country. People spoke German. There were German-speaking lands, but there was no united Germany. So what he was Holy Roman Emperor. As Palmerston said, it was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. completely misnamed. So Frederick Barbarossa, famous for his name and the fact that he had been a very successful Holy Roman Emperor. He was a good soldier. So we've got 3 trained military men, 3 warriors. So it looks as though it's going to be successful. And to a great extent it was. The Christians recaptured most of the Levant coastline from Tyre to Jaffa. And after a lengthy siege, a famous siege, which went on for a very, very long time, they recaptured Acre, a key city in that part of the world. Tremendous triumph, tremendous, very, very long siege. And it looked as though it was going to fail. And then right at the last minute, the Christians won Acre. So full of enthusiasm, thinking, right now, next step, Jerusalem. Not far away from Acre, step and a jump, we'll capture Jerusalem. But there's a famous picture of Richard, it's a Victorian picture of Richard standing on a small hill, but it's made of sand, and he's got his arm over his eyes, shielding his eyes, and it looks at first as shielding his eyes from the sun, but it's an illustration of a legend, or it may very well have happened, that Richard said if he couldn't capture the city of Jerusalem, he couldn't bear to look at it. He couldn't bear to look at the city he couldn't liberate. and the Crusaders couldn't liberate Jerusalem because, well, illness. Dysentery was the curse of medieval armies anyway. You know, they didn't have to go to a hot country to get dysentery. I mean, the hygiene is absolutely appalling for all sorts of reasons, but particularly in a hot country, hot situation, their dysentery was rife, and typhus, typhoid, not cholera. Some people said they died of cholera. No, it wasn't cholera, but you know, take your pick. There were plenty of other things to die of, and heat stroke. Our guide said that many of the crusading knights were dizzy all the time. They were suffering terribly from heat stroke. They were wearing this incredibly heavy armor. Can you imagine it? On a day when it was sort of 90 degrees. And they were unwashed. You know, just bear thinking about how the discomfort that they were suffering. And he really went to town, and he really upset everybody because he started off by saying the Crusaders were thugs. And everybody went, you know, he's a Jewish guide. What do you know? What's he mean they were thugs? And he gone on to prove that yes, they were thugs. They were thugs. They were smelly thugs.
Part cooked thugs.
Yes, part cooked. Yes, but when he described the discomfort that they felt, that they must have felt, it again beggars belief that they were willing to carry on fighting. You know, you have to hand it to the Crusaders. They had this enormous determination and belief in their cause, and that God was with them. God would bring them victory. And our guide Abraham said, you know, the men were falling off their horses with exhaustion, with dehydration, thirst, but above all, the sun. They were suffering from sunstroke. Something good did come out of this, but they didn't recapture Jerusalem. Saladin and King Richard signed the Treaty of Jaffa, which acknowledged Muslim control over Jerusalem, but it allowed unarmed Christian pilgrims and merchants to visit the city. They would not be molested. Saladin gave his word. Their rights would be protected, and as we know, Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, apart from a brief time during the Sixth Crusade in 1229, just for a few weeks. Crusaders won back Jerusalem. Now that treaty, which was seen as a compromise, was actually very valuable. But because they hadn't taken back Jerusalem, that crusade was seen as a failure. But modern historians sort of evaluating, I mean, taking Acre was absolutely amazing, and that benefited, well, everybody, the traders. It was obviously on the coast, and so pilgrims were able to arrive by sea. Many of them did the overland route, but then it became much better to go by sea and disembark in an Acre and then make your way to Jerusalem. Because now Saladin was a man of honor, he was a man of his word, and he kept his promise. The pilgrims would be allowed to travel without being molested, and if anybody cheated them or injured them or overcharged them or whatever, then Saladin intervened on the behalf of the Christian pilgrims. I mean, he was a very, very interesting character, Saladin. He wasn't the monster that he'd been described as in medieval documents. He was a very honourable, upright Muslim. So just a bit about Richard I, and then more next time. So our crusading king, son of Henry II and Queen Eleanor, very well educated, thanks to his father being so well educated. He knew Latin, and he was very musical, and he wrote verse and ballads, had excellent military training, and became an excellent tactician and military, well, genius. Some people said that's probably a bit over the top, but trained to be an army leader. Appearance, well, that didn't do him any harm. Tall, blue eyes, golden red hair. So, you know, he looked good. A fine horseman, but in character, which is often not mentioned. His looks are mentioned a lot, but not so much his character. Willful, proud, he liked his own way, stubborn. You could say, well, determined, but you know, where do you draw the line between stubborn and obstinate and pig-headed and wonderfully determined? You know, where do you draw the line? Reckless, willing to take risks. Again, you can put that on either side, good or bad. I put on mysterious sexual orientation because the jury's out. And I put more of this later. We'll do that next time. Because it's interesting. It's a modern development, the belief that he was gay. Obviously, people didn't face up to that in medieval times, or it would be a flat denial. But it was hardly ever mentioned anyway, because it was so awful, you know, it was regarded as a terrible sin because of the Bible. So if anybody was, they hid it. It certainly wasn't faced up. It wasn't acknowledged. And although when he was born, he was way down the pecking order, his two older brothers died, and in 1183, Duke Richard became England's heir. Constant quarrels over land with his remaining brother, John. Thanks to the father, trying to be fair. I mean, poor Henry II was trying to be fair. He got this enormous empire, and he decided he was going to divide it and give part of the empire to his sons. And it was a big mistake. It sounds really generous and a really good idea. It caused absolute chaos because they weren't satisfied with what they'd been given. If they'd been given nothing, they'd probably been all right. But once he started giving them land, they got greedy and wanted more or different. I don't like this land. I want the land you've given to my brother. So Richard was in the thick of this. He wasn't loyal to his father. He was, you know, very unattractive son, to be honest. Son and brother, totally disloyal. He was thinking about himself, but then they all were. And then world news, 1187, the Muslims had wrested Jerusalem from the Christian king Guy of Lusignan after the terrible losses at the Battle of Hattin. So the Battle of Hattin, which is in Galilee, was very, it was key to the Third Crusade. It was the trigger. By this time, there were two religious groups called the Templars and the Hospitallers. The Hospitallers were pledged to help pilgrims, as it sounds like, hostels and hospitals set up along the route to Jerusalem. And the Templars were fighting for the temple in Jerusalem, a sort of legendary idea. There's nothing left of the temple except the Western Wall. But they called themselves Templars because they were fighting for the temple to release Jerusalem, make it Christian again. They were killed. Many Templars and Hospitallers were killed, so that created another reason for going and defending the Christians, the beleaguered Christians in the Holy Land. Al-Aqsa was re-established as a mosque, and that's when the new Saladin, the new leader, became eminent and known to the Europeans, and he was a Kurd. And we didn't really know about what they were. We know now. Kurds have been in the papers and in the press, and Prince Richard, this is typical of him, you know, quite arrogant, took up crusading, took the cross without consulting his father, which was incredibly arrogant. You know, he could at least have mentioned it. he didn't mention it. He just took the cross and decided he was going to go and fight. That this was a great challenge. This was absolutely up his street. He was a trained leader and a trained wonderful on horseback, and this was a great challenge and a Christian duty to go and liberate the Jerusalem yet again. He was slow to get to the Holy Land because of rebellions and fighting against his father, and then King Henry died, as we know, and Richard is crowned King of England in a very hastily organised coronation, and he sailed for Palestine 3 months later, which shows where his priorities lay, not in this country. He wasn't very interested in being King of England. He was interested in his great Aquitaine, his great Angevin Empire in France, but even more interested in being a crusader. So the next thing that happened was he needed lots and lots of money very, very quickly. How was he going to get the huge amount of money he needed to pay for an army? Because the feudal system was still up and running, but you couldn't just rely on that. You had to pay some of the soldiers to go on the crusade by this time. How are you going to get the money, and how are you going to get the ships? How are you going to get the food? Lots of money needed quickly. He wanted to set off immediately after his coronation. Well, obviously he couldn't. He needed money. So how are you going to get money? Well, one of the groups of people who got money were Jews. Because there were so many things that Jews were not allowed to do, so many areas of life that they were not allowed to be involved in until 1858, when the new law was passed, giving them full citizenship, 1858. They'd taken to money lending, not because that they wanted to, but it was one of the very few things they were able to do, that they were allowed to do. So one of the reasons for hating Jews is that so many people owed them money, because they were allowed, unlike Christians, to charge interest on loans. Christians were not allowed to. Usury was condemned by, well, the Bible and Christian teaching. So Christian money lenders, although you don't hear about them, but if somebody lent you money, you were not allowed to charge any interest. Sorry, if you lent somebody money, you were not allowed to charge interest. And the Jews were allowed to charge interest. Therefore, they became sort of specialists in money lending. It also made them extremely unpopular. They were also sort of victims over and over again, because people just cancelled the debt and either murdered the Jews, so they didn't have to pay the debt, or just said, we're not paying. What are you going to do about it? Again, Richard I, you know, he's not this golden person with the wonderful high standards and the wonderful, you know, standing on the moral high ground. He raised huge revenues by fleecing the Jews, refusing to pay their outstanding debts, raising the taxes for our ancestors, who weirdly accepted this. I mean, normally, if you put taxes up, you get an absolutely negative reaction and violence in the streets, and people in those days murdering the tax collectors when they came round to collect the money. But because he was a crusader, people felt differently. Oh yes, we're willing to support, of course. Yes, we want to do our bit. You know, like the last war, we want to do our bit. We can't be crusaders. We're peasants. We're farmers, but we'd like to contribute. You know, Richard I got away with it. Just saying the taxes are going up. People, oh, all right, paying up without protest, and selling assets of various kinds. And he got the money, and his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had now been released from house arrest, was as busy as a bee, rushing around finding different ways of raising money. So she was key in all this. And off he went on crusade. I was absent from this country for 3 years, which is another way of saying he wasn't a very good king. He didn't seem to care about this country very much at all. In 10 years of his reign, he only spent 10 months in this country. And whenever he came back, it was to fleece people again, to ask for more money for his crusading mission and raise the taxes. So yes, I am a bit prejudiced against Richard I. I don't think he ought to have this fantastic reputation that he has had for hundreds of years.
And John,
because it's based on propaganda and the fact that he was supposed to be this fantastic Christian. But we'll find out next time that he wasn't a fantastic Christian at all.
And Brother John.
Well, we'll do John separately. Brother John wasn't as bad as it made out to be either. So they're good examples of historical bias, which modern historians are very anxious to, you know, dig deep, find out the truth like in a court of law. Let's find out what, from both sides, what the situation really was. How did this person get this amazing reputation for being almost like a saint? And how did this other person get a reputation for being the devil? So it's a good example of we are now digging down a bit deeper and trying to get at the truth.
I'm enjoying every
So-
minute of it.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Judy. That was lovely as usual. Gentlefolk, we'll gather again in a fortnight. Enjoy the sunshine. Take care.